we go. And thank you in advance, Vivian, for letting me know to record. So as we like to do at the beginning of each of our new chapters, which now we're learning chapter 40, which concludes an idea of the power of kavanah, the importance, the crucial foundation of having kavanah, intention or focus as part of our part of our observance. So as I like doing, I just read from the map of the Tanya. As we begin a new chapter, I just tell you in 2 lines how this author, his name is Rabbi Shais Taub, who authored this map of the Tanya. He just likes to put together a 2-line intro for the chapter, and he says like this: the wings of the mitzvah is love and fear. Mitzvahs executed without love and fear are still counted as mitzvahs, but they do not fly aloft to elicit revelations of God's light in the upper world. So it seems like pretty repetitive. It's a concept that we've been discussing for a while, the power of kavanah and the ascension of light that we're able to reach as a result of the kavanah. So even though it seems repetitive from those 2 lines, there's an incredible amount of information in this chapter. Number 1, it's going to start talking about my study of Torah or my observance of mitzvahs without the proper kavanah actually creates angels just on a low level. Just imagine what you're able to accomplish with the right kavanah. So if you want to know how to create angels, you could tune in on page 470 in the middle for chapter 40 in the Practical Tanya book. Or if you're looking in the Kindle, I will be sharing the page in just a moment. So the title is The Power of Kavanah, and we're going to now be on section 1, how you can create angels. I'm going to try to read, we're going to try to get through this chapter in 2 to 3 weeks. And really chapter 41 is, I think, one of the most foundational chapters of the Tanya that will be coming up next. So you could tune in on chapter 40, and I will share the screen. Okay, the power of kavanah. Hope everyone could see the page. This chapter continues and concludes our discussion from chapters 38 and 39. Going to bring this a little closer. See if I can make it bigger. I don't think I have been able. Okay. Our discussion from chapters 38 to 39 about the importance of kavanah, which we're translating here as attentiveness during worship. At the end of chapter 39, we learned that when Torah study is carried out without kavanah, it won't ascend to the spiritual worlds and from there to the blessed infinite one, until you study the text again with kavanah. So one more time, when you study Torah, but you're doing it without kavanah, it kind of remains where it is at. It doesn't ascend heavenward until you do it with the right intention. Either you want to translate that as attentiveness, focus, passion. All those are the correct translation for the word kavanah. But, and here the Alter Rebbe begins, as long as you haven't gone back and studied this Torah text without the authentic intent, your study won't rise up even to the 10 spheras, the 10 levels of light that illuminate the worlds of Yetzirah and Asiyah. Those are the 2 lower worlds. When you have kavanah, it rises up either to Yetzirah and Beriah, depending on the level of your kavanah. But over here, we're saying that without the right intention, it doesn't even rise up to the 10 levels of Yetzirah or even to the 10 levels of Asiyah, which is the lowest of the 4 worlds. As we learned in chapter 39, each spiritual world consists of sephiras, which over here we're translating as God's light, diminished to be compatible with that world. So there's 4 worlds, and there's 10 godly lights in each of those 4 worlds. The 10 lights, the sephiras, are going to be compatible with the level of that world. So the higher the world, the more powerful the level of 10 lights. The lower the world, the more diminished the lights are. But either way, what we're trying to learn here is that only with the right intention is it able to rise up through these sephiras, and without the kavanah, it's not even able to rise up through these sephiras. On an infrastructure of non-divine chambers, when you study Torah with authentic intent, it rises to the spheras of one of the higher worlds, which contain a glimmer of the blessed infinite light. Let's just continue that. Perfect. Because the spheres are divine, and the blessed and infinite light is literally merged and enmeshed with them. If your intent is not for the sake of the divine, your Torah can't merge with the divine energy of the spheres, even in the lowest world. As we learned previously, the requirements for this authentic divine intent is stated in the Tikkunei Zohar. So just to summarize this idea, we know that there's a beautiful enmeshment. The divine lights are enmeshed with the God's infinite light. So when you do a mitzvah or a prayer with the right kavanah, your mitzvah rises to those 10 sephiras, divine lights. And once it's already reached within the divine light, if you do it with the full intention, it's on the highest of the worlds. And then it's able to be totally merged with God's infinite light, which is connected to those sephiras. But what we're learning here is if you're not doing it with the right intention, with the right kavanah, it doesn't rise up to those 10 sephiras. It remains down here. It's not able to merge with the spheras and ultimately with the God's infinite light. And as the Tikkunei Zohar states, without reverence and love for God, your Torah can't rise up and stand before God, right? When you do it without the right love, without the reverence, your Torah doesn't stand before God. It doesn't rise up. But when your Torah study can't rise up and stand before God, where exactly does its energy go? Right till now, I told you it stays down here. Well, let's get a little more specific. Where does it go? We're not talking here about the case mentioned in the previous chapter where the Torah becomes bound by klipa due to selfish intentions. We're talking about when the intentions was neutral, not for God, but not for yourself either, such as study performed out of rote. So we mentioned this already in last chapter. There's 2 levels of not doing it with the right kavanah. One is doing it with the wrong kavanah, which is for selfish intents. I'm doing it in order to seem like a scholar. I'm doing it in order to rebuke that person. I'm doing it in order to go to Disneyland. That's with an intention that maybe will be more selfish based. But when you're doing it with no intention at all, meaning not for a positive state of learning for the sake of Torah, learning for the sake of God, but it's also not for the negative of doing it for a selfish reason. It's just doing it out of rote. This is what I'm so familiar with, and I'm doing it without even thinking. So where does that energy go? We know it doesn't rise up. It's not going down into klipa like if it was done with selfish intents. What happens? Where does it go? And how could it be retrieved? So let's continue inside. Bottom paragraph of the Kindle. Rather, with neutral intent, your study will ascend not to the divine spheres, but to the chambers and repositories in those worlds, which are the superficial dimension of the worlds. And see previous chapter where we discussed it a little more in detail. The superficial dimension is the superficial dimension of a world is its infrastructure, those elements which are there to support the main content of the world, which is the divine light. So listen to this powerful statement, and it's there in the superficial dimension of the world, which can dimension of the world that the angels are stationed. Even though the angels are holy, since they are not the purpose of the world which contain them, they are considered superficial. So let's just summarize this idea. We all know the type of person that is superficial, and some of us connect with them, some of us are friends with them, but your relationship remains superficial because everything remains on the surface. It's not real. A superficial, let's just let someone in, a superficial element of the world is not the main purpose of the world. The spheres are the main purpose of the world, to get the light from there to a lower world. That's the purpose. That's what the spheres is, to compact God's light and to bring it and diminish it in order to be able to be accessed down here. But when you do a mitzvah without the right intention, you're not able to allow that mitzvah to merge with God's divine light, with the sephira. It's remaining on a superficial level of the world. It's not the main purpose of the world. It's a superficial part of the world. That's where my mitzvah light remains until I do it again with the right kavanah. As we learned at the end of last chapter, the power of teshuvah, which is when I do a prayer out of rote, it remains in this repository, the light remains in this repository until I go back and do that prayer with the right kavanah. What happens is not only is that prayer elevated, but even the prayers previously that were done out of rote is elevated as well. But until it's elevated, it remains in that repository, in that chamber of the world that is on a superficial level, which is exactly where the angels are. Even though we know the angels are so holy and they're the ones that sing Kadosh, Kadosh, but we also know that the angels are not the purpose of the world. God didn't create the world to be able to fill it up with angels. God created the world to fill it up with people like you and me that have struggles and tribulations, and we rise above it. We have challenges and we fight through it. The angels don't have those challenges. They're there to support us. They're there to sing to God. God needs his entourage. So the angels, since they are not the main purpose, they're also stationed in these worlds, but in the superficial chambers of the worlds. They're like an extra, an added part to the house. Just like a house, you have the foundation, you have pillars that hold up the house, but then you have pillars that are there just for looks. So it's not a foundational part of the house, it's a superficial part of the house. It's there for cosmetics. So the angels also, they're not a foundational part of the world. They're not holding up the world like the souls are, like the sephira, as God's light is. They are the superficial part of the world. So my mitzvah, without kavanah, ends up hanging out with those angels in that same repository. Let's see why that's an important point, as we'll see in the next few paragraphs. Okay, it should be shared now. The Tanya now cites a source for the idea that Torah, devoid of kavanah, rises to the superficial dimensions of the world where the angels are stationed. So before we elaborate what's the point of saying this, we're first going to bring the source from the Zohar. If I'm not mistaken. Actually, no, sorry, not from the Zohar, from the Tree of Life, from Eitz Chaim, who's written, authored by Rabbi Chaim Vital. Let's see that. He wrote, so just to explain this, Rabbi Chaim Vital was the main student of the holy Arizal. Arizal, his name was Rabbi Isaac Luria, who died in Tzfat in 1572. But his teacher, the Arizal, he didn't write down any of his teachings. His student asked permission, and his student recorded in his manuscripts many of the teachings of his master. So that's why Rabbi Chaim Vital is often cited. I don't know if you remember, but for those who were part of the class in 2019, when we began, Rabbi Chaim Vital is in the first chapter. That revolution, that idea, the doctrine of the two souls is from the same source, Rabbi Chaim Vital, and the name of his teacher, the Arizal. So let's see what he says over here in chapter 2, Rabbi Chaim Vital, blessed memory, in chapter 2 of Shar Yichudim, in the section entitled Shar HaNevuah, which literally means the gates of prophecy. So if you want to know how to prophesy, you should check out this gate of Rabbi Chaim Vital, where he says like this, that from Torah studied without authentic intent, angels are created in the world of Yetzirah. And from practical mitzvahs observed without authentic intent, angels are created in the lower world of Asiyah. And the mitzvahs involving action, when devoid of kavanah, have little light and energy of their own, so they cannot rise to Yetzirah. As we noted above, I'm going to explain this paragraph in a moment. Angels inhabit the superficial dimension of each world. So Rabbi Chaim Vital's statement that Torah study without authentic intent creates angels indicates that the Torah rises to the superficial dimension of the worlds and not to the sephiras. So I'm just going to go back to this page because it's a pretty deep mention of learning how to create angels through our mitzvahs and our Torah study. So just to explain one thing, let me just stop sharing this for a moment. And it may sound repetitive, but we know we have 4 spiritual worlds. The lowest is the one that we are on, which is Asiyah, the world of action. Above us is the world of Yetzirah, which is the world of formation. That's a little more of a spiritual world than the way it is over here in our world. What we're saying over here from Rabbi Chaim Vital is that when I do a mitzvah without kavanah, or when I study Torah without kavanah, my mitzvah or my study of Torah remains in a superficial level of a world. Since my Torah study is more spiritual than my mitzvah, which means my mitzvah encapsulates and takes a physical act. So that remains on a more physical world, whereas my study of Torah is more of a spiritual dimension. So even though it's done without the kavanah, without the right intention, it was done inauthentically, but it still rises to the world of Yetzirah. But once in the world of Yetzirah, that study of Torah done without the right intention remains in a superficial dimension, in a superficial place. So that's creating angels, which is superficial part of that world. And when I do an act of mitzvah without kavanah, which means I gave charity, but I did it without the right intention, it rises to the world of Asiyah, which is really where we are. It doesn't go to the 10 levels of Sephiras there. It actually remains in the superficial part of the world, and it creates angels in the world of Asiyah. We're going to learn, if I'm not mistaken, shortly, the difference between the angels in this world versus the angels in that world of Asiyah or Yetzirah. But the main idea is that my mitzvah or my study of Torah without kavanah doesn't have the ability to rise up. It remains in the superficial part of that world, either Yetzirah or Asiyah. And later, if I come back and I study with the right kavanah, with love and with more reverence and with intention, passion, then it's able to rise up to the highest of worlds and connect with God's divine and infinite light. Okay, let's see that inside. We are at the top of the page, and let me just find the page of the book if you're looking inside the Practical Tanya. 472, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. But we see that Torah study or a mitzvah devoid of kavanah does at least enjoy some level of spiritual ascent and it rises to the level of the angels. It turns out then that the Tikkun Zohar's teaching that worship devoid of kavanah can't rise up and stand before God doesn't mean that the worship can't rise up at all. It just can't rise to the Sephiras and thereby to the Blessed Infinite One. But it can rise to at least the superficial dimension of Asiyah in the case of a mitzvah, or Yetzirah in the case of Torah study. So it does rise up, just not really that high. It remains on a superficial dimension. And all the angels, so this is a very interesting point where he elaborates on the character of the angels. He says like this, all angels consist of both matter and form. And this is from Nachmanides, known as the Ramban, not to mix up with Rambam, which was Maimonides. This is the Ramban. And then the Shar HaGemul, and therefore they are incompatible for the spheres which are divine. So the way he's explaining it is angels have a form and also a matter. And therefore they can't merge. They're incompatible with the spheres which are fully divine. Angels are, of course, the next paragraph, entirely spiritual, and they don't possess physical bodies, but they are a complex amalgam. If I got that word correct. I was looking at it before and did I not pronounce that correctly?
Amalgam.
Oh, amalgam. Okay, thank you. Before, when I was preparing this class like an hour or two ago, I never saw that word before. What is
an amalgam is a mix of materials.
Okay, awesome.
Like we talk about dentists fill our teeth, they call it amalgam. It's a mixture of metals.
Perfect. Whatever. Okay, good example. Thank you. So these angels, they don't have physical bodies, but they have a mix, an amalgam of different energies, not all of which are equally devoted to God. That's why the angels constantly sing and bow to God in an effort to subdue that part of them which is less inclined to worship. Their less inclined component is what the mystics refer to as the angels' matter. So I love, this is from the Rebbe, from actually one of his earlier talks in 1950. And just to explain it, I love the idea where Nachmanides says that angels have a form and also a matter. So a matter makes it seem like it's somewhat physical, but it's not. It's a spiritual being. So what he's saying is the angels have not a physical component, but they have a part of themselves that they're always working on subduing. That's why they're always bowing to God. they're always praising God because it's their way of fixing or working on the part of them that is less inclined to worship God, which is an amazing thing to think about angels, that they have a part of themselves that they're pushing aside. We always think of souls that way, as human beings that way. To think of the energy of angels also having the matter, which is not really physical, but it's a part of them that they need to incline or they need to push a little further. That's what the Ramban, the Nachmanides, is referring to as matter. So when we say angels consist of matter and form, or form and matter, it just means that they have an amalgam of different components, some of it being less inclined to worship. So the matter of them is that less inclined part that needs to be worked on, and that's why they're always working on subduing themselves, praising, bowing, worshiping, etc. The Tanya refers here to this concept of angelic matter and form to add clarity to the idea of a neutral intent. Lacking kavanah doesn't mean that your act was totally mindless. It means, for example, that you studied Torah or prayed and understood the meaning of the words you were saying, but your intention wasn't to connect to God. That's why even the angel created by such worship has matter and form. Matter corresponding to the physical enunciation of the words, and form corresponding to the basic understanding of what you were doing. This is from the Rebbe's father, taught over by someone, I guess, who heard it from the Rebbe's father, whose name was Rabbi Yeshua Korf. So just to explain this idea, I find that to be a beautiful paragraph where he explains the reason why our prayer or our study or our mitzvah is able to create angels, but those angels are, like we said, in the superficial level of the worlds of either Yetzirah or Asiyah, is because when we say a prayer, there's two parts. First of all, we're understanding the meaning of what we're saying. That's more the spiritual component of it. Then we're actually uttering the words. We're singing it. We're praying it. We're moving our lips at least. So the more physical component of it is creating the more physical matter part of the angel. And the more spiritual component is understanding the meaning, is creating the more spiritual part of the angel, which is the form. But yet, even under, and this is, I guess, the kicker here, that even when you understand the meaning of the words, that doesn't mean it's done with the right intention. I could be understanding what I'm saying, but not really praying to God. You're enjoying the Hebrew poetic words, or you're enjoying the power of the words without understanding of who I'm speaking to. So even that is considered without the right intention, meaning you're understanding the meaning of the words, but it's still not done with the correct kavanah. And therefore, it doesn't rise upward. It remains just a little bit higher than where you were before, either in the world of Asiyah or in the world of Yetzirah, just on the superficial level of that world, and hence the expression that it's creating angels, which is also the superficial part of the word. All right, I did not share yet. We are towards the top. And for those that are following along inside, you will realize now that we're going to be coming up momentarily to a footnote. There's actually, if I'm not mistaken, 2 footnotes in this chapter, and we're not going to go through the footnotes. One of the footnotes begins towards the bottom of 473, and it continues at the bottom of 474. It's just below the line. So we're going to be skipping over the footnotes. Okay. We're at the bottom of 472 if you're looking inside the Practical Tanya, and we're at the top of the Kindle page if you're looking on the screen. Up to this point, we have been discussing what happens to Torah study devoid of kavanah. Now we turn to the spiritual address of Torah study with a negative intention, when the study was motivated by selfish reasons. So again, till now we were saying it was done out of rote, it was done without the right intention, but not with a negative intention. And then it just remains in a superficial dimension of either world of Yetzirah, Asiyah, and it creates those angels. But now, if it's done with selfish intent, it's a little more complicated. But Torah, which is studied with a completely inauthentic intent, such as to be celebrated as a Torah scholar, etc., simply doesn't ascend heavenward at all, even to the chambers and repositories of the sacred angels. Rather, the Torah remains below temporarily in this physical world, which is the repository of klippas, etc., or just of klippas. So that requires teshuvah to remove it from there and to elevate it higher. The Tikkun Zohar statement that the Torah study without kavanah can't rise up and stand before God can mean two different things in different circumstances. If there is a neutral kavanah, when the Torah will rise, it just won't rise before God, and instead will get stuck in the superficial dimension of the spiritual worlds. But if there is selfish intent, then the Torah won't rise at all and will become stuck in this world of Kalipa. And as we're studying, it's always a reminder in our life. We could be doing, this idea of kavanah, doing things with the right love and reverence, with the joy, with the passion. It involves in everything we do. We all know that an employee that is committed to the business, that does things intentionally, could be, even if he's not as experienced, but could do so much more for the job, for the business, than someone who's extremely experienced and bright, but is just doing it because of the paycheck. And have much more so when it comes to our relationship. You could be so engrossed in your relationship, but really for selfish reasons. You're going out on a vacation and you're treating your spouse, but really it's because you need a buddy to do it with. So it's all really with a selfish intent. But how much more when you're, so that's if it's with a negative intent. And even if it's done with no intention at all, or just out of rote, this is what we do every month. We go out on a date and we talk, but it's not really with an intention. It's not really with the intention of building on our relationship, of enhancing and deepening who we are as one. But here's the beauty. You could go back to those moments retroactively. One powerful date that's done with the right intention could elevate all of those spiritual dates that were just done out of being roommates. So, but that's the beauty of what we're saying here. So I don't know for sure if that works in every relationship, but I can guarantee you that's how it works in our relationship with God, because that's what the Tanya is talking about. That when you do a prayer, when you're studying Torah, without any intention at all, it rises up just a little bit. If you're doing it with a negative intention of being a Torah scholar or for whatever selfish reasons, it goes to a place that doesn't rise at all. But then you could go back and elevate all of those previous opportunities that were missed and do it with the right intention. So just to confirm one more point, when the Zohar says that it doesn't rise up, it could be referring to two different levels of learning or performing of mitzvahs. One is performing it with no intention at all. So then it actually rises up a little bit, but it remains superficial in the world of Yitzira or Asiyah. Or if it's done with selfish intent, then it doesn't rise up at all. It remains stuck in the worlds of Klipas. Now we're going to bring a very famous verse from Solomon from Ecclesiastes. Some of you are very familiar with this verse. In the Hebrew, it actually sounds better than in the English. So I'm going to say it in the Hebrew, and then I'll translate it. Let's see it. The bottom of the Kindle page. The Tanya now brings two sources to support the idea that Torah performed with selfish intent won't rise from this world. So let's see the verse. It's the top line in the Hebrew, so I'll just translate it. I'll say it in the Hebrew, and then I will translate it. Kamosha Kasu Bezoar, like it is said in the Zohar, I'll pasuk on the verse. And here's the verse from Ecclesiastes. Ma Yisrein la'adam. What advantage, what gain is there for a person b'chol amole, with all of his hard work, sheyamel, that he toils tachas hashemesh, under the sun. So let's see how he explains this. Meaning, the simple meaning of the verse is a person could work from today to tomorrow, get up early and work hard. But what's the point of it all with your work? Really, our toil has to be. Let me just finish the verse from the Shlomo Malach. He doesn't quote it here, so I'll just tell it to you. Amalei shalaylam ein yisrein. With all the toil you do in the world, it doesn't advance you in who you are. Aval amalei shalaylam, but in the toil of God, yesh yisrein. There is an advantage when you toil for the sake of Hashem, for the sake of God. So let's just see it now in English as a Zohar state commenting on the verse. What gain is there for a person, for a man, in all his toil that he toils under the sun? that toil without gain includes even toiling in Torah if he does it for the sake of bringing honor to himself. Then it will remain under the sun, and it will not ascend heavenward. So the way the the way the Zohar is translating the verse is that any toil, even if you're toiling in Torah, which seems to be an incredibly spiritual pursuit, but yet it's done with a selfish intent, it's therefore only for you, for the person, then it remains under the sun. It doesn't rise higher than the world. It remains stagnant here. And this explains the saying of our sages, happy, or in Hebrew, ashrei, happy is the one who comes here to heaven with his learning all in his hand. It's a famous quote from the Talmud. What does that mean? Meaning that he should be happy that his Torah rose heavenward and did not remain down in the world. So in the Hebrew, ashrei mishabalakan v'talmudai biyado, that a person is fortunate or happy that he comes here to heaven and his learning is in his hand. That it rose heavenward, meaning his learning is with him. So let's just stop there. I'll take questions, but just make sure this theme is understood, that especially these last few quotes from the Zohar and from the Talmud. So just to explain it in short, we know that kavanah, the intention, allows your mitzvah and the light of that mitzvah to rise up and allows your soul to rise up. But if it's done without kavanah, either with kavanah, with the negative kavanah, with the selfish intention, or with no kavanah at all, it doesn't rise up, and it requires teshuvah to be able to release it from the klipa, the selfish part, and elevate it to higher, or to remove it from the superficial dimensions of worlds and to reach the sephiras, the godly light, and then eventually to reach the infinite light. Yes, Lynn.
So I'm thinking in light of today's Torah or this week's Torah study, where it's talking about building the Mishkan after.
Yeah, for sure.
And so that the word, I believe, is not amal like it is here, like it's toil, but it's more service, which is more spiritual. So are you saying in a way that when we do a mitzvah without kavanah, it's more amal, but if we're doing it with kavanah, it would be building something spiritual like a avodah or even malacha? Or is there a connection there, or is it just my mind going?
No, I like that connection, but I would have to disagree, even though it actually sounds good, especially from the way we're learning it, that he's saying that if you're toiling, it remains under the sun. But then if you're working, it doesn't. I think toil, usually the way we refer to Torah, it should be in the way of toiling. And the reason is because we all know that a person who has a deadline and they have to make a certain amount of sales, they could be getting calls from anyone in the world, but they don't answer. They're committed to go to pound the pavement, fully focused. So when it comes to Torah study, the mitzvah is to study with the same focus and toil as you would in your business. So even if you're not learning quantity-wise the same amount as you are putting in your business, we just can't survive that way. We have to work. We have to make a living. But quality-wise, the toil in your study of Torah should be equal to the toil that you would do in your business. So that's asek Torah. Usually the word over here, it's actually using the word amal. But another word is actually like the labor intense, or in Hebrew is actually business is called asek. Baal asek are business people. Asek is a business. So many times in our Torah, we actually refer to it as osek b'Torah, labor in your Torah, because that's actually the way you should study Torah, putting your phone away, putting your worries away, the same way you would do in your business, that you have to be fully focused. You should have the same labor, the same toil in your Torah as well. So
I was thinking of the la'asok, the divrei Torah, so that's where my brain.
Exactly. La'asok b'divrei Torah, exactly, the blessing, exactly. So it's just that over here, you're right. Over here is referring to if you're toiling, but it's toiling with selfish pursuits, it doesn't rise up, it doesn't go anywhere. So, but thank you for bringing that up. All right. Any other questions before we continue? Okay, here we go. Section 2. So now we know we could create angels. but we know we could do so much more than that. Now, section 2, why Torah can't rise without kavanah. The Tanya questions the fundamental assertion of Tikkunei Zohar that Torah study without kavanah can't rise up and stand before God. For even though the Torah and God are totally one, since God is one with his will, so how could any act of Torah not be able to ascend heavenward if the Torah is the diluted will of God? Even after its descent into this world, shouldn't it rise up and stand before God, even without your kavanah? Which means it's God's Torah. I'm studying it. I should be connected to God, regardless of the kavanah is there or not. So in answer to this question, the Tanya continues, but the matter is not so simple, since the Blessed Holy One also pervades all worlds equally. And nevertheless, the worlds are not equal in level, the differences arising as a result of the recipients. So this needs a lot of clarity. So we'll allow the author to do the explanation, and then we'll try to explain it on our own as well. Your Torah study or mitzvah takes place in this world, meaning in a place where the Torah's identity as the undiluted will of God is not manifest. That's where your Torah is taking place. So in order to break free from that reality and ascend to higher worlds where God's presence is evident, it needs the boost of your kavanah. Your kavanah has the power because it takes place in the setting of this physical world where you and your mind are stationed. Despite the lie which the physical world wants to tell us, that God is not present and Torah is not his undiluted will, kavanah pierces through that illusion and neutralizes it. So from God's perspective, that illusion never existed. And the Torah you study is always one with it. But from our perspective, unless there's kavanah, then your Torah can't rise to God because it's still trapped by the illusion of this world. So I think this is a pretty powerful idea. We may need clarity as the Alter Rebbe himself will continue, but just to explain it, from the question that now is brought to the table is, if Torah and God are one, let my Torah study be directly connected to God and rise up. Why would it not be able to rise up? Because of my lack of kavanah. And what we're answering is, there's two different perspectives here. From our perspective, we are involved in this world. The world, and this is a very pretty common statement in Kabbalah and Hasidus. So if you've been around the block of Chabad community, you perhaps have heard it. The word olam, which means world, has the same letters as the word ha'elam, which means concealment. Because like everything else in the Hebrew language, every word has a significance and meaning. So the fact that concealment has the same word, the same letters as the word world, is because they're connected. The world conceals and hides over godliness. That's the job of our world. If world would not conceal over godliness, it wouldn't be doing its job. The job of the world is to conceal over godliness. It makes it harder for us to want to do the right thing. It makes it harder for us to want to commit to God. It's part of the free choice. That's what the job of the world is. So the world conceals over God. So from the perspective of the world, it's trying to share a lie that godliness is not here. Really, godliness is here. When we say the Shema, we pronounce God's oneness. We're saying that we are fully active with God, that this world is fully connected with God. That's the meditation of the Shema. But without that meditation, from just a world perspective, you could look at the world and say this world is chaos. This world is everything but godliness, because the world conceals over godliness. So what we're saying over here is that from our perspective, when we are studying Torah, but we're doing it without the right kavanah, the world is there to keep it and to tell you that it's not connected to God. So from God's perspective, the Torah you study is connecting with him. But from the world perspective, from your unintentional study, it's not rising up. It's telling you that it didn't go anywhere. Let me just share the screen again and make sure we got that right in the way the author explains it here. So let's just read that last paragraph again. From God's perspective, that illusion never existed. And the Torah studies always went with it. But from our perspective, unless there is kavanah, then your Torah can't rise to God because it's still trapped by the illusion of this world. So it's a powerful idea. And I would love to there's a practical lesson that we will hopefully get to today. So let's continue inside. We're doing good. As we discussed in chapter 38, the divine light that shines in the various worlds differs in two respects. The first is that the upper worlds are capable of receiving infinitely greater illuminations than the lower worlds. There is less tzimtzum, that powerful word we used before, which is diminishment in the quantity of the light in the upper worlds. So in the upper worlds, they have a greater illumination than the lower worlds because there's less tzimtzum. Let's turn the page. And the second is that the upper world receive God's light without as many filters and veils as the lower worlds. There is less hester panim, which we translated as reduction in the quality of the light. So just to summarize this point, in the higher worlds, there is less diminishment in the quantity, and also in the quality, less reduction of the quality of the light. As we discussed in chapter 38, tzimtzum is like looking at someone's illuminated face through a small aperture. It's the same image, but it doesn't shine as brightly. Hester panim, which means this quality diminishment, is like looking at someone's face through a partially opaque filter, which alters and distorts the image itself. So that's more of a quality reduction, whereas the tzimtzum is more of a quantity diminishment. The divine light and energy entering all the worlds suffers from both hester panim and tzimtzum. But in each world, these forces operate to different extents. So the lower the world, the stronger they operate. And therefore, you would imagine that in our world, it has the strongest diminishment and reduction of both quality and quantity. And this world is the most inferior world of all in both these two respects, hester panim and tzimtzum. Firstly, because the light found in it suffers from tzimtzum to the absolute extreme, which is why this world is material and physical. In this world, the divine light and energy have been diminished so much that you can't even see it. That's why this world is material and physical. So again, it's the more tzimtzum, the more it's diminished, and therefore the more physical the world becomes. So our world, which has the most diminished light of quality and quantity, and therefore it's the most physical. Yes, Naomi. Oh, you are muted. Oh, yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. Why does it say material and physical? Is there a difference between those two concepts?
Let's see the Hebrew, and that's a good question. Let's look at the Hebrew words and translate them from there. Usually that's helpful. Chumri and Gashmi. That's the two words. Chomer and Geshem is the root of the words. So they definitely are translated in material and physical. I don't know if this would make sense in the English language to explain material and physical, but in the Hebrew, usually Chomer, which over here is material, is more mundane, more material than Geshem. Let me try to give you an example. Sometimes Chomer is actually translated as coarse, which is more coarse, more, I don't know how to translate that, but so it's, I don't know if that would explain to you that material, which over here is translated as Chomer, is a deeper type of lowliness than Geshem. If anyone else has a translation,
I think could it be that like physical is more neutral and material is more pejorative or negative? Could be.
Yeah, it's more material, so it needs
less
a little
holy
more work.
Or even less holy or something.
Yeah, maybe.
Different level.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Good.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. I'm not sure, but yeah, you're welcome. So in this world, okay, so just to summarize this point, in our world, which has the most diminishment, in Hebrew it's called tzimtzum, and the concealment of light, a reduction of the quality of the light. That's why it's more physical, it's more material. And secondly, even this diminished light is additionally obscured by many filters and veils, to the extent that the light is able to become enmeshed in the force of klipas noga, providing energy for all the ritually pure things in this world, including the energizing animal soul, which powers speaking in men. So again, the speaking that we have is from the animating soul, the energizing soul, right? The nefesh hachiyunit, the nefesh habahamit, the animal soul. But now the diminished light acts through the klipas noga, which is the animating soul, to be able to allow the person to speak. Let's just read that again. So this diminished light has filters, veils, that it's enmeshed in the klipas noga, and that provides energy for the animating soul to allow the person to speak. For divine light, which is truth, to power klipa, which is falsehood, a diminishment of the quantity of the light of tzimtzum is not enough. There also has to be the powerful hester panim, a downgrade in the quality of the light. So all this is just a background for the next paragraph. And if you didn't understand all the differences and details and nuances, that's fine. But just the main point is the downgrade to get from a spiritual, all godly world to get to our world, which is all physical and material. It has to go through a double part of diminishment. One is a diminishment of the quantity, which in Hebrew we're translating as tzimtzum, a diminishment of the light. And then another we're translating from the Hebrew as hester panim, which is more of a veil and an opaque separation, which we're saying over here as a quality diminishment or reduction of quality. And both of those is what happens in our world. So the godly light is being diminished qualitatively and through quantity to be able to get to our world. So now once you are in our world and you're studying Torah without kavanah, that's why you can't rise up yet. Let's see the next paragraph. And therefore, when you speak words of Torah or prayer without kavanah, without intent, even though the letters are sacred and the energizing animal souls, klipas, noga, cannot in any way place a veil of separation to impose hester and hide the sanctity found in those letters, nevertheless, the amount of God's light which shines in this world through these words of Torah or prayer spoken without intent is extremely diminished due to the tzimtzum affecting this world. In chapter 38, we were first introduced to the fundamental principle that hester, panim, and tzimtzum work independently of each other. In our case, the fact that the Torah and God are totally one means that Torah suffers from no hester panim at all, even in this physical world. His will, as expressed in the Torah, is undiluted, suffering no blurring or distortion. But when it is expressed in this world, that will does suffer from tzimtzum. So without kavanah, you have an act which is totally God's will. But that fact is barely evident and manifest. So even though God's will is able to come down here, but it's not able to be manifested because you're not doing it with kavanah. So it suffers from that symptom when it's in our world. So let's just continue. It's obviously, I think I warned you at the beginning of last chapter that this one is going to be quite an intense chapter, and you could see it right now inside. The good news is that we're around halfway through the chapter, and hopefully this will bring the full idea home. That is in essence the Tanya's answer to our question. The question was again, why it cannot rise and stand before God. If it's Torah, it's one with God. But before clarifying the answer in detail, the Tanya will first digress slightly to compare Torah without kavanah to the case of non-sacred talk. Meaning non-sacred talk is most of our conversations, when it's not with a purpose of godly intent, when it's not a Torah-based discussion. So let's see how that's connected. Speaking words of Torah without kavanah is in no way comparable to speaking non-sacred words, devoid of Torah content or purpose, where the energizing animal soul does impose Hester and hide God's holiness. You can't compare Torah without kavanah, where there's no Hester panim, but there is Tzimtzum, to non-sacred talk, where there is both Hester panim and Tzimtzum. Non-sacred talk suffers from Hester panim because it's powered by klipas noga in your animal soul, which acts as a thick veil, downgrading the quality of the divine light in this physical world. And your animal soul suffers from Hester panim, which is again the quality reduction, in the same way as the energizing animal soul of all other living creatures from a kosher species, which are from klipas noga. This leads us to the difficult question of how God is found in klipas noga and evil. In Judaism's monotheistic belief, everything is from God. There cannot be a demonic force opposing him, which he himself does not power. So how could it be if godliness is found in everything? How could God be found in klipa, in evil? How could that be from God? And even though there is no place devoid of him, which is from the Zohar, and God is definitely present, even in klipa energy, and we're turning the page in the Kindle, nevertheless, he is the most hidden of all hidden, or in Hebrew, the word is setimin, and it's called a God that hides, mistater, from the prophet, from Isaiah. Both terms share the same Hebrew word as Hester. So what it means, I don't know if you answered the question yet. Let's read further, I guess. And let me just tell you the page over here. Interesting. I think we're on 478 in the book, if someone could confirm that.
477 in the book.
Thank you, 477 then. Okay, thank you. I lost the page there for a moment because I'm looking on the screen. So that doesn't mean that God is totally hidden and can't be found at all in the world. It means that even the light and energy that flows from him into this physical world is hidden by numerous powerful filters and veils until that energy becomes enmeshed and hidden in the filter of klipas noga. While non-sacred words suffer from Hester panim, being powered by klipas noga, sacred words of Torah do not. So just to summarize, you have a diminishment in the quality of the light of Hashem that is found in non-sacred words, but is not found in Torah done without kavanah. Because the Torah, it remains the letter, the words of Torah, the words of God, and therefore it can't be reduced qualitatively as our non-sacred talk is able to. That is not the case with the sacred letters of Torah, words and prayers that you speak, where not only is klipas noga absent from the acts which are powered by the godly soul, but on the contrary, the klipas noga is actually transformed to good and absorbed into holiness through this activity as mentioned above. The sacred words of Torah do not suffer from Hester panim, the absence of kavanah, but they do suffer from tzimtzum. We are going to stop here. I just want to read. There's a lot of, let me just turn the other way. I want to get to, we're going to pause there. And I want to read to everyone the practical lesson, because it is important to me that we have something practical that we could walk away with this. This is extremely one of the deepest chapters, a very in-depth idea of Kabbalah, the diminishment of the quality or the quantity of life, and how are we able in this world, in a world devoid of, hidden of holiness, to be able to access it. So let's just see this practical lesson and read it as follows. If you're looking inside us on 479, so it's skipping a little bit ahead, but it's summarizing the general idea. There are three categories of kavanah or intention. A positive intent, that your mitzvah is for God, will propel that mitzvah to the spheres, which is the divine light in the heavens, and thereby to God, to God's infinity. Then you can have a neutral intent, where you are focusing on what you are doing, but it's not devotional worship. That will send your mitzvah to the superficial dimension of the spiritual worlds, and it will create angels, because that's the superficial part. And then you have the selfish intent, will cause your mitzvah to get stuck in this physical world and entangled in the negative forces of Khalifa. So that's ultimately the main point of today's lesson is when you study Torah and it's done without the right intention, it's done with a more selfish intention, then it's being downgraded through the tzimtzum. And therefore, the only way to unleash it from the klipa is through going back and studying or praying or doing that mitzvah with the right intention. If you do it with no intention, which means not with a selfish want, but not for the sake of God, then it remains in a superficial world, in a place that is where the angels are, like the Zohar says, creating angels. And there you could actually elevate it higher, doing it again. But ultimately, the point is to do it from the get-go with the right kavanah. Okay, again, I'm sorry I went a little fast. It's a pretty deep idea, and I wanted to make sure we are able to get through it. God willing, next week we will be concluding this section, which is chapter 40, which concludes the whole idea of intention. And from there we go to chapter 41, which is an incredible chapter, really delving into the theme and the concept of reverence of God and developing love for God, how it's done through our meditation. So for many chapters, I've been telling you, wait until we get to the chapters in the 40s, and we'll get into the power of our intention and our meditation. That will be coming up, God willing, in the next chapter. As a result of this chapter, where it tells us the importance of doing it with kavanah, and then we're going to get into the tools, how to develop that love and how to develop that reverence. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you, God willing, next week. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.